Alright, we are back and we are just drawing out our roto shape for our patch. So what we want is something like that. And you can either just hook this up and then pre-multiply it by RGB and replace the alpha. What I like to do instead is to first copy the alpha in and then pre-multiply it. The reason for that is then you can still manipulate this alpha. You can blur it, erode it. If it's in your stream, it's more annoying to do that. So yeah, this is the way I like to do it. It's more nodes, but there are nodes you can get that will perform this function just with one node. Cool, so we have our patch. So let's reverse the stabilization that we've done up here. So if you ever have a stacked stabilization like this, in order to properly match move it, you actually need to do it in reverse order. If you just do it in the current order, so if you change that to match move and then you inverted the corner pin, you're actually going to get an incorrect result. So you're not actually reversing what you did up here. You actually have to do it in reverse order. So the corner pin comes first, and then the tracker comes second. So let's do a quick test of that merged over the plate, and we'll just see how we're looking. So even though we haven't turned on motion blur yet, we can see that the match move is working pretty well. We can also see why it is that we want to be blending between patches here. The lighting is changing so much from the start of the shot to the end of the shot that it would be such a pain to try and grade this patch here to match what's happening around it. And you might be tempted to think, I'll just put a grade here and knock up the gain and that's matching nicely, but there's so much going on here that a grade is just not going to take care of. You can just see how much it's changed. In this case, I know that in order to get it to the standard that is, it really needs to be, grading this patch just isn't going to cut it. Even if I did a really good job grading it, it's just not going to cut it. The majority of the time, the further away from the reference frame, the worse it's going to be matching the plate. So, back here it's matching pretty well because it's close to the reference frame, which is just frame 2. Up here it's matching really poorly. It's so far away from the reference frame. So if I put another reference frame here, that is, I do another patch here that it's going to dissolve into, it's going to be matching really well here, it's going to be matching really well there, and then all I have to worry about then is the frames in between. And then maybe I decide that I want another reference frame in the middle to sort of act as like an anchor between the two reference frames, which we are actually doing. Then you have 3 points within the timeline where we're accurately matching the plate.
And that's the value of doing additional patches, so long as those patches are blending seamlessly together, which we're going to ensure that they are through our workflow. As long as that's happening, then it's almost the more the better in terms of the accuracy to the plate that you're going to achieve. Of course, you have to balance that with how long you've been given to complete the shot. On a shot like this, it will obviously get to a point where creating additional patches to get that extra and a 1% of accuracy is not going to be time well spent. But the more shots you work on, the better you're going to get at figuring out where you're going to get the most bang for your buck and making decisions around that balance between time spent and just how perfect it really needs to be.
So the next step before we start painting up our second frame here is to get our first patch tracking and warping in as accurately as possible. So if we just bypass our match move for the time being, and we're just going to hook this up to our stabilized plate, So if we look at this, and then we look at the merge, and we go to our frame 9, which is where we're going to paint up our next frame, we can see sort of the discrepancies here, and these are the kind of discrepancies that we're going to try and correct with our grid warp node. So let's pull up a grid warp node. So our grid warp node is going to set up this gigantic grid for us, but we actually want to create our own custom grid, which in my opinion is really the greatest feature of the grid warp node. So if we click on this button up here, then we can click and drag and actually create our own grid. So what we're going to do is we want to create a source grid. So if we change that to source, and then what I normally do is I just reduce this divisions to the lowest amount, which is 3, just so we can start from scratch, because we're going to be adding our own points. So when it comes to creating your own grid, the idea is to put points where you want to have control over the patch. And looking at this patch, we definitely want to have control over these 4 corners, and I think we could probably, that might be all we need. So we'll just go ahead and we'll just set up the grid like this. So to create more points or more extra divisions, just click on the plus and then click wherever you want it. And we can turn that off if we want to see the whole thing. So once I've done that, we also really want these handles to be correctly aligned with the forms of the suit. This is going to actually give you much greater control over these lines, and it's just really difficult when you don't have that. To manipulate these handles, if you just hold control and then you can move them individually. So if you don't hold control, then it will move them as a tandem pair. Another tip is if you're moving these points around a lot, and if you circle them all and hit Z, it'll kind of reset them, and it'll almost kind of smooth the points and kind of interpolate them, but then we'll have to go back and fix them like this. We could go one step further and set up a more detailed grid and sort of capture these lines and this inside shape, but I don't think it's necessary. I didn't need it when I first did this task. I think I got away with it, so we'll just keep the shape nice and basic. One other thing is always make sure your grid is larger than your patch. If your patch goes over the edges of your grid, you're gonna have all sorts of problems. It'll either cut it off or it'll reveal the original unwarped grid. So just always make sure that you have plenty of buffer when it comes to the sort of the edge of your patch and the edge of your grid. So once we have that, we can make sure that we have a key set up on our reference frame here, and then if we go back to source warped, we can see it'll look totally crazy because our source grid is different from our sourced warp grid or our destination grid. So what we want to do is copy the keyframe from the source grid and paste it onto our destination grid. And so now if we compare before and after, we can see that no warping is taking place. This is our reference frame, it shouldn't be changing on this frame, so this is exactly what we want. And now we can move back and forward in the timeline, setting new keyframes on our destination grid as we need to. So the frame that I'm most concerned about at the moment is frame 9, because that is our next frame that we're going to be patching up. And if we go to frame 9, we can see how well our patch is lining up with our plate, and it's by no means terrible, but we can see areas that we want to refine. One thing I really like to do when I'm trying to match a patch as accurately as possible to the plate is actually deactivate the paint. Sometimes you've done so much paint or you've changed the plate so much, it can actually be difficult to see all the reference points that you want to be able to see in order to see what refinements need to be done. So with the plate deactivated, you can really tell what areas need to be refined. So I'm just going to refine this a little bit where I think it needs it, and then we can move on to the next patch. And remember, control dragging these points is going to let you individually control these points. And you will from time to time want to turn on the paint and make sure you're not kind of warping the shape in any way that we don't really want to. I think we're pretty happy with that. Let's just step through and make sure that there aren't any other frames where it's really misaligned. Oh, so this often happens, and I don't know if I messed up there, but there should always be a destination key on the reference frame. So here you can see that we're warping on the reference frame. If you see that, make sure you just copy and paste that frame, so we have nothing happening on the reference frame. So let's just step through. Cool. We're not worried about what's happening past that, because we're going to have a new grid warp node that's taking over from our second patch that's going to be starting on frame 9. So let's move on to our next patch, and as I was saying earlier, we don't want to paint up this frame again from scratch. We want to use what we've already done, our paint here, as a basis for our next patch. And we can do that just by hooking our merge up to our frame hold. And as always, we want to use as much of the original plate as possible. So I don't want to just slap the whole patch over and then this to become our new patch. Instead of doing that, let's attach a mask to our over, so then we can be a bit more selective about how much of this patch we want to be using. So as you can see, that there feels a lot more true to the original plate than this does. Here, where we're really changing areas that we don't really want to. Just feels like we're changing more of the plate than we really want to. Let's turn that back on. And then we can refine this patch if need be with another paint node. By the way, if you hear me clicking while I'm painting, that's because my Wacom tablet just broke. So, and also we can refine our patch before it's merged over. We can, if we think maybe it's looking a little bit too blue, we can, bring those blue values down a bit more. If we want to be a bit more selective about where we're doing that. If we just think these values around here are a bit blue, we can just paint that in. Cool, so I think we're pretty happy with that. We'll just do the same thing down the bottom here with a frame hold. Let's I think we can just copy this roto. We should be able to just use the same roto because it's stabilized, so the patch should really be in the same place. Cool, so now that we have our second patch, in order to be as accurate as possible, we want to also warp this patch backwards. We could create a new grid warp node and do the same thing we did over here, but we're never going to perfectly replicate the warping that we've done on this patch. What we want to do is apply the exact same warping that's happening here, but just going in the reverse direction. And doing that is actually easy. Let's just copy and paste our grid warp node. Now what we're trying to do here is to create a new reference frame. And remember, a reference frame is essentially where our destination and our source frame are the same. So as we know, up here our reference frame is frame 2. We're trying to create a new reference frame on frame 9. So at the moment, we're getting a warping on our reference frame. That's no good. And the way we create a new reference frame is we want the destination grid and the source grid to be the same. So how we do that is by copying the destination grid and pasting it onto the source grid. So now there is no change. And now the only thing left to do is to delete our original key on our source grid. So we've created a new reference frame on frame 9 and it's warping backwards. And it's doing that in a manner that's going to exactly match this patch here. And we can see that if we flick between the two. So those are matching really nicely. And I'm much more concerned about the elements all lining up than I am about any sort of color difference. Cool, so we can actually hook up our dissolve node now and see how that's going to work. Pull up a dissolve. Then if we just set a key, our reference frame, so this is going the 0 pipe, so set a key, go to our second reference frame, set another key, switching to this patch, and now we can see what our patch is going to look like as it's dissolving. And then we can see what that looks like over our plate. Cool, that's giving us a really good result. And we are going to get to motion blur at some point. Obviously it's not matching through these frames here where there's heavy motion blur, but we'll deal with that. Now that we have our second patch, let's look at how we're going to create our final patch. So if we go to the frame of our final patch and then we merge this, it should be obvious that we're not going to be able to do what we did over here. For all the reasons we talked about earlier, this patch is just not really matching our plate at all. The forms are off, it's more defocused, just the values are all completely different. So we will have to paint up another frame here from scratch, but it's still going to be advantageous for us to use this patch to inform where we're painting. Because if we just start guessing where our lines are supposed to be, we're putting ourselves in that position where we are just guessing and we're just kind of hoping that our shapes are going to line up with our other patches. So we can do better than that by using this patch to inform where we're going to draw our shapes that we're going to be using to create our paint. Before we do that, we need to grid warp our second patch so that it's matching our stabilized plate on this frame. So again, we're going to disable our paint and then refine our grid warp until we have it matching a little bit better. And this is going to be a little bit trickier just because the patch is quite different. And we can even disable our patch here if we want to compare the two frames more directly. See what that's looking like with our paint turned back on. Cool, so I know that's not matching perfectly, and you're never going to get it matching perfectly, just by light of the fact that it's changed so much. But what's important is that it's in a much better spot than it was. We're not even going to be able to see this patch on this frame. And now that we have that warped into place, we can use this as our guide for where we put our shapes, as we've done up here when we painted up that frame. So let's do that now. Cool, so hopefully you can see why it was useful to use this as a reference. Like, who knows where we would have put these points, if we didn't have this guide. And don't forget, above all else, we're trying to make sure that these patches are matching each other as they're dissolving between each other. So I'm basically going to go through the same steps as I did up here to paint up this frame. So let's do that. So our patch does feel like it wants to come in a little bit, so maybe let's just do it in a road. It's feeling better there. I think when it comes to this bit up here, I think it's just going to be easier if we just grab this section and just flip it and just use that to create it. So let's go ahead and just draw a quick shape. Pre-multiply it. Merge it back over our patch. And then I'm just going to rotate this patch. And now we're just going to maneuver it in place until it feels like it's kind of in the right spot. And don't forget to reference the shape that we created up here. We went to all the trouble to establish where these shapes should be, so we don't want to just undo all of that by kind of guessing this and just eyeballing this and getting it wrong. So that looks pretty good there. We don't need to be too crazy about it. So obviously we don't want to use this whole patch here, so let's just bring up a paint node, hook it up to the mask input for the merge, and now we're just going to paint in where we want it.
And even though I know we've been doing a lot of manual painting to create our patches, and particularly a lot of smearing, I should emphasize that when you are creating a patch, there's really no substitute from sourcing directly from the plate to build your patch. In any way that you can borrow from the plate, whether it be from another part of the frame or from another frame in the timeline, it should always be what you go to first. So that includes what we're doing here, grabbing another part of the plate and transforming it into place, or just using the clone tool. Nothing is going to look like the plate more than the plate itself, because it will have so many subtle details that are going to be so difficult to reproduce.
The reason we're using the smear tool so much here is basically because we can get away with it on account of there isn't a huge amount of detail in this plate. So even though we're kind of destroying a bit of the finer detail, we're actually still able to get it looking a lot like the plate. And I just wanted to make it clear, since we have been using a lot of the smear tool, that it is a pretty blunt instrument, so you do need to be selective about when you're using it. Just being careful not to undo any of our existing paintwork. Something like that. Yeah, I'm definitely not thrilled about the way it's changing there, so let's just refine that a little bit. I think maybe we didn't need that scale after all. That's good enough, we can refine it. So I'm not using the smear tool here just because there's a feeling of that we actually have some detail in here, and you know, if you use the smear tool, one thing the smear tool is amazing at is just destroying any detail. Clone brush is the way to go here. You know, and then if you want to go in after and maybe bring up some of these highlights a little bit. And then we have something like that. And then that should be fairly closely matching, in terms of position I mean, that, which as you can see it is. So that gives me high hopes that these patches are just going to blend really seamlessly together. Cool, so now we just need to create our patch again, so let's just try and see if this Roto is going to be good for it. Yeah, not really. Well, yeah. Let's just refine it a little bit. And then don't forget to delete the existing key. So now that we've done that, once again, we need to copy our Gridwarp node over onto this frame and create a new reference frame on frame 18. So at the moment, this Gridwarp here is meaning that this patch is matching the plate on frame 2 and frame 18. Well, we need to be making sure that it's also matching on these other frames, particularly on the last frame, but also on these sort of in-between frames. So let's do that now. So let's hook up our Gridwarp node to our stabilized plate, and then let's go ahead and step through, see if there's refinements to make. So I think definitely on the last frame. Feels like it's shifting. Looks like we need to shift this patch a little bit left, particularly on the screen right side. So just circle these points and control click on our little handle here. We could just bring that in a little bit. And then stepping through to our final frame. It's a little bit hard to tell because there's so much motion blur happening, but I think the whole patch wants to come. So as you can see, we can not only use this grid warp node to warp certain areas of the patch, we can also use it actually just as a transform, just by shifting the whole grid over.
And in case you didn't know, I'm just hitting Q to hide the overlay of the grid warp here, just so I can get a better view of them when I'm flicking between them.
Alright, this frame, it's a little bit hard to see what needs to be done, so we'll just leave that frame. We'll just leave that frame till the end, so it'll be easier to see once we've actually turned on motion blur. But let's go backwards as well. Okay, so I'm convinced this is a bug in the grid warp node. So if we go back to our reference frame, we can see that it's actually changed on the reference frame. It's actually warping. So if you see that, it's a simple matter of just recopying the source grid over the destination grid. And there we go, we're back to where we were. It won't have affected any of our other warps. I don't know why it does that. In my opinion, the grid warps are one of the buggiest nodes in Nuke, at least that's just in my experience. But I also find it to be pretty indispensable. So yeah, I wasn't looking too bad through these frames. I mean, there's so much motion blur happening that I don't even think you're really going to notice any small inaccuracies through these frames. So let's just step backwards. I think we were pretty good through these frames, so I think we're pretty good for that. So now we've done that, we can go ahead and copy this grid warp node, hook it up to our final patch, do what we did before, create a new reference frame by copying the destination grid and pasting it onto the source grid. So created a new reference frame, and then we're just removing the source grid key from our original reference frame. So now we have this frame. Oh, I forgot to put a frame hold down here. So now we have this patch matching pretty nicely on this frame, and they should be matching pretty nicely throughout, warping in unison. Cool. Cool, so now let's hook up our dissolve node. So now let's talk about when we're going to be dissolving between these two patches.
It's often the case where you don't just want to be using the reference frames to start and end the dissolve. Sometimes you might though, sometimes you might just want to linearly dissolve between the two patches. That might be what's going to give you the result that you want. Other times you might want it to hang on one patch for quite a bit longer and then abruptly dissolve to the next patch over just a few frames. It all depends on what's happening on the shot. So you kind of need to do an analysis of what exactly is happening in the shot and figure out where are the best places for those keyframes.
So we kind of want to look at when it starts changing a lot. So if we step through, it's not changing much on frame 10, but you can see on frame 11 that the lighting's starting to change on it. It's starting to get a bit bluer. So let's set our key for our frame 9 patch on frame 10, so it's fully on frame 10, and then it's going to start dissolving on frame 11. And then let's go from the other direction, so let's go to 18, and then work backwards and see where it kind of starts changing in a sort of meaningful way. You can see 18, 17, 16, there's nothing really changing value-wise, it's pretty consistent, but then from frame 16 to 15, you can see that there's quite a bit of change happening. So I think maybe this is where we want to end our dissolve on frame 16. So let's set a key for 2. So that means our patch, our final patch, will be fully on frame 16. So let's see what that looks like. So you're free to step through now and see how well the dissolve's working. Over these frames, I think it's working pretty well. If there is a frame where it seems to be standing out and you think maybe the weighting of the dissolve isn't right, like it should be leaning more towards one patch over the other, you can always adjust these values. So we can, let's say that we want it to be more weighted towards the patch that's hooked up to the 2 pipe, so we can increase this number, and then you see you brighten up those values, and it's looking like it's sitting in with the plate a bit better. So you're free to adjust these values, adjust this curve, whatever you need to do so that it's matching as seamless as possible.
Cool, so at this point I'm going to turn on motion blur and just pre-comp this out. It's going to be a lot faster to preview this when it's pre-comped. For some reason my computer doesn't like this script when I turn on motion blur. So let's just quickly pre-comp this out and then we'll go from there.
Alright, so I have that pre-comp now, so now we can watch it in motion. Looking pretty good. There are a few issues that we want to fix. A few areas to refine. I think potentially there's some grading to be done on it. This patch is looking a little flat. The plate's looking a little bit brighter than the patch. There's some areas where I think we could probably be stenciling out our patch and just revealing the plate underneath. There's a really obvious issue on the last frame here with the motion blur not calculating correctly. The reason for that is we only tracked to 22 frames, so motion blur is basically only calculating 1/2 of the motion blur where it's there, and then it's missing the motion blur that should exist as a result of the movement between frame 22 and 23. So in order to fix that, what we have to do is actually make up a keyframe. If we don't have additional plate to source from, we're just going to go ahead and just invent it. So if we're looking at our keyframes here, we can probably imagine that it's going to continue down here. So we just go towards that frame and then just manually just pull that keyframe there. And then if we switch back to our plate here, turn on motion blur, and then if we compare the two, you can see that motion blur is calculating much more accurately to the plate here. And we also have some motion blur quality issues. You can see this kind of sketchy, sort of noisy motion blur. That's a quality issue, and we can fix that by increasing the motion blur samples. And we'll do that just before we decide to render for the final time. And while we're here, let's also fix this last frame where it feels like it's not moving properly with our plate here. So let's go to our grid warp and let's see if we can get this in a better place.
So now that it's looking heaps better, we'll just re-render that last frame.
So as I was saying before, I think there's areas where we can probably look to reveal the original plate. And if it's a fast moving shot, such as this one, quite often I'll just do a little setup right before the merge, where I'll just stencil out our patch. And then I can just use a brush and just sort of paint the patch out where we don't want to see it. So let's go to the really bad frames. I think these frames through here where the lighting is, these values here are quite significantly different than the plate, so I think we can definitely look to sort of reveal the plate here as well. And normally I do not recommend painting on a frame by frame basis. You kind of need to know when you're going to get away with it. You know, if we weren't seeing such broad movement from frame to frame. I wouldn't be doing it this way. I'd probably use a roto shape or something that's going to give me more consistency, but you're not going to notice if there's discrepancies between sort of what you're revealing from frame to frame, just because the movement's so extreme. Cool, I think it's just looking much more seamless through those frames now.
Alright, I guess we can talk about grading now as well. If we go to our last frame there, you can see that our patch is quite a bit brighter than the rest of the plate. So let's fix this. So whenever you're grading a patch, you always want to be grading on an unpremultiplied patch, then do your grading, and then premult the patch afterwards. The reason for this is we never want to be grading any of the values outside of the patch. So the unpremult premult is going to be basically limiting the effect of the grading to the alpha of our patch here.
So maybe we just want to grade on the gain here. So so it looks pretty good here. I think on frame 20 it's looking good. So let's set a key here, and then let's go forward to 22. Quite a bit darker, quite a bit brighter. Sorry. So let's grade it down. It's also looking a bit bluey green. So let's pull a little bit of that out. Let's bump up the red, pull out a bit of the green maybe. A little green. Cool, so that feels a bit better there. And let's check frame 21. That feels fine. Cool, so let's just check that out. How's that looking? It's looking pretty good. I think the only thing catching my eye is that we maybe have some grading issues in the middle frames over the dissolve between the second and third patch. So as the last thing I do before we move on, I'm just going to go in and either adjust the dissolve node like we did earlier, or adjust our grade. And then once we've done that, we can move on and start discussing what we need to do to kind of take this shot to the next level in terms of accuracy and faithfulness to the plate.